Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about STEM Girls Virtual. On this show, we talk about different roles people have in STEM fields, such as science, technology, engineering, and math. Normally, we talk to someone who's currently working in a STEM field, but today's episode is a little special in that we're going to learn about a pair of sisters who over 100 years ago broke down a lot of barriers to become the first and third woman in the United States to receive a medical degree. And joining us today is author Janice Nimura, who wrote a book about the Blackwell sisters. Janice, thank you for being here today. Can you tell us what interested you so much about the Blackwell sisters that you decided to write a book about them?
Well, I grew up in New York City, and I went to a proudly feminist all-girls school from the age of 5 all the way until graduation from high school. And I loved math and science, and I got to college and thought I wanted to be a doctor and started out pre-med. And all along that road, somehow I never heard of the Blackwell sisters. In fact, I never heard of them until just a few years ago. And I was shocked that I had gone all that road without ever coming across them. And I thought, when I started to ask around and ask other people, is it just me, or do you know who these people are? And people generally, even very well versed in history people, hadn't heard of them. And if they had, they generally said, oh yeah, I had a book about Elizabeth Blackwell when I was a little girl. And I thought, this sounds like a story that's ripe for retelling. And then I discovered that though Elizabeth Blackwell was famous for being the first woman doctor, her sister Emily was the third woman to receive a medical degree, and no one ever knew anything about her. And even the children's books really rarely mentioned her much. So I really wanted to set out to reintroduce the Blackwell sisters to the 21st century and to tell this story as a story of two sisters who supported each other toward this very outrageous goal at the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. What's the name of your book? Because I fully intend on reading it when it is published.
Right, it will come out in the beginning of the year in 2021. Elizabeth Blackwell's 200th birthday will be February 3rd, 2021. She was born in 1821. So the book is timed to come out in time for that. It's called The Doctors Blackwell, How Two Pioneering Sisters Brought Medicine to Women and Women to Medicine.
Wow, it sounds awesome. So some people might be surprised to learn that the Blackwell family does have Cincinnati connections. They lived here at one point. When was that, and what were they doing while they were here?
So the Blackwells they originated in Bristol, England, and their father was a sugar refiner. He moved the family to America in 1832, to New York at first, but his goal, he was a strange paradox. He was a sugar refiner, so he made his living in the sugar industry, but he was also a passionate abolitionist. And the sugar industry was based in slave labor. So his goal was to find a way to be a sugar refiner with sugar made from sugar beets that could be farmed in the North without enslaved labor. So after a few years in New York, he moved his family all the way out to the Wild West of Cincinnati in 1838. When Cincinnati was still a very small town,
right,
with this goal, this dream of finding a way to grow sugar beets and become stay in the business, but change the sort of moral picture in his industry. So he moved his 9 children and his wife out to Cincinnati in the summer of 1838, and immediately, within 4 months, died. Leaving them in Cincinnati with about $20. So the whole sugar industry part of the picture quickly evaporated, and the Blackwells at first opened a school for young girls in order to support themselves. The oldest children in the family were girls, so they were the ones who had to figure out how to earn a living, and that's what they did at first. So Elizabeth Blackwell was in Cincinnati from about 1838 until about 1845, and the family was there until about 1856.
Wow. So this is quite a large family. Elizabeth and Emily are both doctors. They sound quite accomplished. So is there anything else about the sisters that we might find, besides them becoming doctors, really, really cool?
Well, the interesting thing about the Blackwell family, there were 9 children, 5 girls and 4 boys, and none of the 5 girls ever married. They were a remarkably feminist family before there really was a word for feminism. The five women in the family all pursued different kinds of lives out, all except one pursued lives outside of marriage, and domestic life. There were the two doctors, one was a journalist, and one pursued painting. And the men in the family, two of the four sons, married two of the most famous feminists of the age, Lucy Stone and Antoinette Brown. So as a family, they were very unusual in their approach to women in education, what women could be, unconventional pathways.
Yeah, they sound really interesting. People tend to, of the sisters, recognize Elizabeth a little bit more. Do you think there's a reason to that?
It's good to be first. Being first is always a quicker path to fame.
Right.
Elizabeth Blackwell was an unusual woman, even without her claim to fame. From a very early age, from her teenage years, she really had a sense of herself as someone who could do something important. She was really not interested in marriage and motherhood, the conventional paths. She read voraciously, and one of the things she read was the work of a woman named Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller wrote a famous book called Woman in the 19th Century, and in that book she made a point that women could be anything they wanted to be. Just being a woman didn't mean you were incapable of whatever it was you wanted to do. Being a woman just meant that you had to put in exactly the same amount of effort and have the same amount of innate skill as a man, and if you did that, you could be anything you wanted. And Elizabeth Blackwell, reading this, really felt like she wanted to be one of those women that proved this point about what women could be, and that women needed to prove their own abilities. And so it wasn't that she was profoundly attracted to science or healing or taking care of people. She really wanted to make this point about the abilities of women, and medicine presented itself sort of unusually as a pathway that would be open to that. Medicine in this moment was a field that was trying to establish its own legitimacy. Being a doctor had, before this, been more of a trade. It wasn't really a profession. It wasn't particularly all that respectable, but increasingly it was. And increasingly in America, there were medical schools. So, in the olden days, to be a doctor, you would apprentice with whoever the local doctor was, and then you were a doctor. But increasingly, as the 19th century moved on, there were more and more medical schools that offered a diploma and a course of study and examinations. And Elizabeth Blackwell thought, if I can find a way into one of those schools and study all the courses, take all the examinations, who can say that I'm not as qualified as any man who's done the same course of study? So she decided to try that route to proving this point about what women could do and be. And so she went and tried to find herself a seat in a regular men's medical school, which was an outrageous thing to do, because think about it, a woman sitting next to men in an anatomy class, cutting up dead bodies for dissection. That was appalling and impossible for most people's imaginations.
So I imagine she faced a lot of challenges trying to get into med school. Ultimately, where did she go? Where did she study?
Well, I mean, today getting into medical school is a huge challenge. Back then, medical school was not particularly prestigious. Medicine was what you studied if you weren't intellectual enough to study law or to become part of the ministry. So going to medical school was really just a matter of being a man with enough money to pay the fees. So it wasn't that it was hard to get in terms of the work you had to do. It was just that Elizabeth was a woman without a lot of money. Both of those things, strikes against. So she studied, sort of apprenticed herself to sympathetic doctors who were willing to teach her things. Became, sort of a protege of doctors who were prominent enough that when they supported her, when she finally sent her 11th application letter to, a small provincial medical school called Geneva Medical College in Geneva, New York, in the Finger Lakes, the faculty of that medical school, they didn't really want a woman to come to the school, but she had been endorsed by a prominent physician who said, this woman is smart and she should come to your school. So the faculty at this school, being fairly cowardly, decided instead of just rejecting it, they would ask the students, and they said to the students, okay, students, this woman wants to come join our class. If any one of you is against this, we won't let her come. And they assumed that the students, at least some of them, would be against this and it would be safe. They wouldn't have to deal with this woman who wanted to come to medical school. But the students sort of thought it might be a prank that another medical school was playing on them. So they thought, oh, that would be hysterically funny. Why don't we say yes? All right, everybody say yes. Okay, say yes. And so they did, and the faculty, it was, found themselves in a hard place and had to Elizabeth Blackwell. And then she showed up, and it wasn't a prank at all. And she actually excelled in the class, of course, because she was determined in a way that none of her classmates really were.
Right. And yes, so 19th century medical school is vastly different than today, vastly. So Elizabeth excelled at her courses. So in medical school today, you get a lot of hands-on training. Did she get a lot of hands-on training in medical school, or did she go somewhere else to get that training?
Right. So medical school in the 19th century was really a lot of listening and not any doing. You listened to lectures. If you were lucky and you went to a well-equipped medical school, you maybe got to do some dissections. You never touched a patient. You never saw a patient. Maybe in between terms, if you went home and followed your local doctor around, you might see some patients. But in medical school, there was no practical training at all. So people graduated from medical school with a horrifying level of ignorance, really no experience treating ill people. So Elizabeth felt this acutely. She really was appalled at her own lack of knowledge. It was terrifying. So in medical school, then you did 2 terms in 2 successive years, basically 2 winters in a row. So in between those 2 terms, she spent several months studying at Blockley Almshouse in Philadelphia, which was a huge municipal hospital for the poor. And then after she graduated, she went to Paris and trained at a maternity hospital in Paris, and then to London, where she trained at St. Bartholomew's, which was another huge municipal hospital for the poor. I mean, back in that time, if you were in a hospital, by definition, you were poor, because if you had any money at all, the doctor would come to you. So that the training that she was doing was very much among the poor, and it very much shaped her attitude toward medicine, because over the course of her career and her life, she really came to see her mission as more of a public health mission than an actual treating patients kind of mission. She saw in those, horribly unsanitary hospitals full of miserable patients, wretched people at the ends of their ropes, she really started to make a connection between poverty and disease, between some of the basic hygienic practices that you could teach that would help prevent rather than end up where those people had ended up.
And the issue of public health is talked about very much today, given the current circumstances we're living in, quarantining, and but public health was evolving when Elizabeth and Emily were in medical school. So what is public health? What was public health to them?
Right, you hear that phrase all the time today, right? We're in the middle of a pandemic. It's a public health crisis. Public health is the science of protecting and improving the health of people and their communities, right? That's the CDC definition, the Centers for Disease Control. And you achieve public health by teaching people about how to be healthy. Public health was just emerging at this point because cities were just emerging in an urban way, in the way that we understand cities today. Of course, there had always been cities, but now there were industrial cities, and the population density in those cities was higher than what we've known in the past. And because of those intensely dense cities, which anywhere you have intensely dense populations of people, you also have dense populations of rats and lice and fleas and all of the disease vectors, contaminated water, that encourage epidemics to take hold. But this was before germ theory. This was before antiseptic practices. So epidemics killed thousands of people, thousands and thousands of people in every city every year. So public health as a practice, that the government's responsibility in part was to figure out what was going wrong and help people be healthier. This was just starting to be an idea of, what organized society's responsibility was. And it fit very well, as I say, with what Elizabeth was learning. Interestingly, as her sister Emily came up behind her and also became a doctor, their approaches and their opinions of what it meant to be a woman doctor would diverge, because Elizabeth really became more and more and more sure that a woman doctor, the role of a woman doctor was as a teacher armed with science, that a woman doctor's job was really much more to teach the public about hygiene and prevention. In that sort of traditional role as caregiver and nurturer and mother and nurse. Emily Blackwell was a really fine surgeon and practitioner, and so she had a slightly different view of what a woman doctor should be. She really thought a woman doctor should just be a doctor who happened to be a woman, just like a man.
Yeah.
And that would sort of come between them as their lives progressed.
So talking about Emily, where did she go to study? Was it easier or harder for her in some ways than Elizabeth?
So Elizabeth, having chosen this path of medicine, she knew it was going to be a lonely path, and she really wanted to have a companion on it. The Blackwells had a very high opinion of themselves as a family, and so it was natural for her to want her companion on this path to be an excellent Blackwell, just like her. So Emily was the most intellectual of her other siblings. So she said, "Okay, Emily, it's you. I want you to do this." And Emily said, "Oh, okay." It appealed to her, this challenge. Paradoxically, it was even harder for Emily to get a place in a medical school than it had been for Elizabeth, because Elizabeth goes to Geneva Medical College, she excels, she graduates, it's extraordinary. And then Geneva itself and all the other medical schools closed their doors even more firmly against women, because, oh my gosh, a woman actually got in and she was successful. We can't let this continue, they said.
Perish the thought.
Right. So in fact, when Emily came along, there were two reasons why it was harder for her to get a spot. One was that Elizabeth's success had caused some consternation among the traditional medical schools. The other problem was that in response to the growing interest in medicine among some women, a couple of female medical colleges had opened in Philadelphia and in Boston. And these were schools specifically for women who wanted to study medicine. Elizabeth and Emily thought that they were fairly mediocre schools. They were, in this sort of tradition of separate but equal that we are confronting hard right now. It was the same problem. They were separate. Women were welcome to go there, but they were nowhere near the caliber of the regular medical schools. So not only did the male medical schools not want women, but they said, "Why do you want to come here anyway? There are female medical colleges for you to go to." So it was even harder for Emily to find a spot. And in fact, she at first found a spot at Rush Medical School, which is in Chicago, and went there very happily for a year, found a sort of a mentor among the professors there who kind of took her along. After that first year, he decided to go spend a year in Europe, and the trustees of Rush said, "Actually, please don't come back. We'd prefer it not to see you again. You may not finish your degree here." She was halfway there. And so she scrambled, and she was quite resourceful and quite determined, just as determined as Elizabeth. And she immediately took herself to Cleveland Medical College, which is now part of Case Western, and finished her degree there. So in fact, it was an even rougher path for her. And then after she graduated with her same terrifying lack of practical experience, she had an amazing sort of postgraduate training experience in Edinburgh in Scotland. She sort of attached herself to a very prominent doctor called James Young Simpson, who was one of the most prominent doctors in the United Kingdom. And it was fascinating that he was willing to take on a female assistant, but she became one of his assistants for a year in Edinburgh and learned a tremendous amount about his field, which was obstetrics and gynecology. And then after that, she followed Elizabeth's footsteps to London and Paris and did more training there.
And the sisters ran into someone whose name is quite recognizable. They ran into, at least Elizabeth worked with Florence Nightingale at one point, right?
Never worked with her, but definitely encountered her and befriended her. So when Elizabeth was studying in London in 1850, she and Florence Nightingale were introduced by a mutual friend. And 1850, if you know your Florence Nightingale history, is before Florence Nightingale is Florence Nightingale. She, at this point, is not particularly famous. She comes from a wealthy, well-traveled family who really want her to get married, and she really doesn't want to get married and really wants to go into nursing. And she meets this woman, Elizabeth Blackwell, who has basically sort of freed herself from her family and from the expectations of marriage, gotten a medical degree, is now, studying at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Florence Nightingale is enthralled by Elizabeth Blackwell. Elizabeth Blackwell is enthralled by Florence Nightingale because Nightingale represents a kind of social stability that Elizabeth envies. Elizabeth, although her father did quite well, her father died, left the family in fairly dire straits. Florence Nightingale's family lives in a beautiful, huge mansion, and she enjoys a kind of social security that Elizabeth kind of envies. So they get to talking, and they really hit it off because they have very similar ideas about the importance of hygiene and prevention and public health, this new idea. So they always have this friendship. They also always have this disagreement, which lasts their entire lives, which is that Florence Nightingale believes very strongly that women should be nurses and only nurses. And Elizabeth Blackwell believes that women should be doctors. Not all women, but that the idea of clearing the way for women to become doctors is just as important. And so they always agree to disagree about this. And their paths cross on and off throughout their lives.
Okay. The sisters wind up in New York City and they open an infirmary. Can you tell us what an infirmary is and who did they serve in this infirmary?
So they started out with something called a dispensary. Back in the 19th century, a dispensary would have been sort of the earliest form of community health. Most poor people couldn't afford to have a doctor come to their house, and they certainly didn't want to go to a hospital, which was full of disease and germs and where only the most desperate people went. So those people who didn't want either of those two extremes would go to a dispensary, which was a place that offered free medical advice and first aid to the poor. And it was a place where doctors, got important training and exposure. And so first, Elizabeth opened a dispensary. It was a one-room dispensary that was open a couple of afternoons a week. It was called the New York Dispensary for Indigent Women and Children, and it offered help to poor women and children, offered help from herself, a woman doctor. So it was sort of a way to sort of get some practice, because when she got back to New York with her medical degree and even with all of her training, she couldn't find any patients because most people who had money to spend on a doctor didn't trust the idea of a woman doctor. So the dispensary was a way of trying to establish something. And then a few years after the dispensary, which was only one room and it was very kind of a small endeavor, when Emily had finished her training, and then accompanied by a third woman doctor called Marie Zakrzewska, who had come from Poland and Germany, they opened the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children, which was the same basic idea, but it was a whole building and had enough room for some inpatients.
Wow.
There's a dispensary in the bottom where people could drop in and get first aid or a cold remedy or help for a cut. And then there were wards for women in labor, there were wards for people who were ill, and it was for women and children for free, and required substantial support from wealthier donors to make it work. So they started this infirmary that was the first hospital entirely staffed by and intended for women. And it was in a building, it's in its first incarnation, it was in a building that still stands in New York in Greenwich Village.
Oh, wow. So you could go visit it, well, the outside of it, I guess.
Go see the building. There is a lovely plaque that says Elizabeth's name on it. So
that's really neat.
yeah.
While they're in New York City, during this time the Civil War breaks out, what did the sisters do to help the war effort?
Right. So the war breaks out, and immediately there's this flood of energy and eagerness on the part of the women of the North to help the cause, right? But nobody really knew how to do that well. So there was this flood of supplies and food and women rushing down to Washington to volunteer as nurses, even though they had no experience. And it was very chaotic and not particularly helpful, frankly. So Elizabeth and Emily could see this, and so they had a meeting at their infirmary in April 1861, right after the first shots were fired in the Civil War at Fort Sumter. They had a meeting, and at that meeting, which involved a bunch of their sort of allies and donors, they drafted an appeal that ran in the newspapers the next day that said, okay, everybody, all women of New York who feel the patriotic cause to help, please come to this big gathering tomorrow at the Cooper Institute, which is another building that still stands in Greenwich Village. And the next day to this gathering, something like 3,000 women showed up.
Wow.
And out of that huge meeting grew an organization called the Women's Central Association of Relief. And their job was to sort of collect and transmit supplies and also to recruit and train nurses. And Elizabeth and Emily led the committee that figured out which women would be suitable for nursing at the front and what needed to happen to them to get them ready to go to Washington and then be sent on where they were needed. And so Elizabeth and Emily did that work, and the work of the Women's Central Association of Relief eventually morphed into the U.S. Sanitary Commission.
Oh, okay.
It was the most important civilian organization of the war. And it was, you could draw a direct line from Elizabeth and Emily's efforts to that incredible organization. However, after a year of helping to select and train nurses, they became completely disillusioned because the male medical establishment in New York was not interested in really working on a peer level with female doctors. So they would not let the women that they were choosing to become nurses would go to various New York hospitals to train, but no one would let them train at the Blackwell's hospital because it was a women's hospital. And Elizabeth and Emily became a little disgusted after a while at the kind of, yes, you can help, but only to this point and no further. And that was very frustrating. And after a while, they said, "Forget it. We've put in our year. We've selected and trained 100 nurses. We're out. You can carry on your own. We've set the stage, and we're going to go do the work that we want to do because we're not getting the credit that we deserve for the work that we're doing." So they actually ended up sort of sitting out about half the war, and moving on to their own projects. So it's an interesting story of both achievement and frustration.
Right, and one of those projects was they went on to found a medical college, correct?
Right, exactly. Now, that was the one thing they said they were never going to do. They weren't going to found a women's medical college because women's medical colleges were inherently mediocre because, they weren't as excellent as the men's ones. And they sort of assumed that if they successfully went to men's medical schools, that the men's medical schools would acknowledge that women could do it and would let more and more of them in, but that hadn't happened. And so women weren't going to the prestigious men's medical colleges, and the women's medical colleges were So they thought, okay, we're changing our minds. We're going to found a women's medical college that is going to be better than any of the men's ones. So they founded a college that was for women, but it had standards of rigor that were much higher than any college that women could have attended to that point. And that was how the Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary was born. And that happened in about 1868.
Oh, wow. And Emily would go on to oversee the college for some time. Were the sisters working together, or were they kind of doing separate work?
Right. So, as I mentioned, they diverged a little bit in their approach to what a woman in medicine should be. Elizabeth had also always pined to go back to the United Kingdom. She was 11 when they left England as a child, and she had always thought of herself as English at some level and had always wished she could go back and practice in England, but of course things just weren't as advanced as far as what women could do in England at that point, so it had made more sense to stay in America. But finally, when the Women's Medical College was founded, now 1869, Elizabeth thought, Emily's doing great. Emily would really rather that I got out of the way, so I'm going to go to England. And so in 1869, Elizabeth moved to England and never came back. So for the last 4 decades of their lives, they were on separate continents. So their story as partners sort of ended. And Elizabeth went to England and became really much more of a public health advocate than a physician. She didn't really see patients, but she did a tremendous amount of writing and lecturing about moral reform, about public hygiene, whereas Emily stayed in New York and ran the York Infirmary and the Women's Medical College. And really, it's sort of an irony, but in doing so, she sustained the legacy of her sister, her pioneering sister, almost to her own detriment. So, in the end, today, we sort of know Elizabeth Blackwell's name because of all the things that she achieved, but it was Emily who really sustained them to maturity and, for 30 years ran them by herself. It was part of why I really wanted to tell this story as the story of both of them, because without Emily, those institutions would not have flourished the way they did.
Right. It wasn't until I spoke to you initially that I even learned that there was a second sister who also became a doctor that I share a first name with. So that was really exciting to learn about a pair of sisters that broke these barriers. If the sisters were alive today, how do you think, I could guess your answer, but how do you think they would react to what's going on with the current pandemic? What would they be doing?
Right. Well, I think, as we've learned, Elizabeth would be out there making sure everybody washed their hands, explaining what social distancing meant, railing against people who were relaxing those standards too soon, really making sure that people understood that preventing something is better and easier than curing it after it happens. Emily, I think, would be, organizing her hospital, making sure she had plenty of PPE, making sure there were hand sanitizers installed in every doorway, and training her staff to use ventilators. She would be much more on the practical side of things, dealing with the patients, whereas Elizabeth would be dealing with the prevention. They ended up on those two sides of things, I think.
Right. They've left quite a legacy. What do you think, what advice would they give to young women and girls who are interested in entering a STEM field?
It's interesting to think about it. In the 19th century, the 19th century was an era of pioneering women. There were women breaking boundaries all the time. We owe so much of where we are to those first path breakers. But the meaning of feminism to the Blackwell sisters was very different from the way we think of it now. I think, especially Elizabeth, really, she was not interested in, she would say, I'm not interested in an anti-man movement. I just want women to take themselves in hand and prove what they can do. We don't need men to apologize or take off our chains. We are enchaining ourselves. And if we raise our own standards and get to work, and if we are excellent, the world will recognize us. So her approach to being a woman in a scientific field was to be beyond reproach, to do things so well that nobody could criticize her. And she really believed that if she did that, the world would come to meet her. That's an approach that I think is a little controversial today, that sort of, just be good, don't make a lot of noise, don't break anything, don't make a fuss, just be quietly excellent. I think we're in a very different place now as far as what your role is as an activist. Elizabeth and Emily didn't really see themselves as activists. They saw themselves as leaders, as maybe as beacons of female achievement. But they weren't, for instance, they were not for women getting the vote. They thought, it doesn't make any sense to give women the vote while they still are not independent thinkers. Let women sort of establish themselves, their own independence, before they have this tool that they wouldn't know what to do with. So that's very controversial. It's part of why I like this story, because Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell were um, not necessarily feminists the way we would define them. They were much more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm.
And they were sometimes too conservative for the progressives in their time, and also too progressive for the conservatives in their time. And they were very human in that way. It was a muddy story. So I think they would say to women in setting out in science fields today, be as excellent as you can be. And that hasn't changed. That's still a good message. I would add today, it's okay to say, call out unfairness.
Right.
And don't just quietly accept what is unequal. That's the layer that we've gotten to today, that it's more allowed to do that. In fact, it's important.
Yeah. Well, it's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you for joining us. Again, the name of your book, again, I can't wait to read it.
It's The Doctors Blackwell. It will come out in January 2021 from W.W. Norton. And I'll look, maybe I'll even get a chance to visit Cincinnati and bring it along.
That'd be great. Well, thank you again for joining us today, Janice. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.